Working early.
With a handwriting on the counter.
Okay, now is it working? I can hear myself, yes. Okay. I've been with Equality Ohio now since 2008, so I think that's about 5 years. Prior to that, I was with a group called Equality Toledo for another 2 years. So I've been lobbying legislators since 2006, whether it's a big group like you're doing right now or just individually. I'm also a registered lobbyist, so I do go and talk to them individually. And we've been working on LGBT issues for a long time. Many of you are familiar with the 2004 election when the Constitution of Ohio was amended to say that marriage is not only between a man and a woman, but not only that, there was a second line that said neither the state nor its subsidiaries will recognize any legal status, right, that approximates marriage. I'm paraphrasing, but that's basically what it said. And so we've been having to work around that particular constitutional amendment. Fortunately, the Ohio Supreme Court, when they did rule on one case, it was actually a heterosexual case that they ruled on. It was two people who were living together. He beat her up, and under the domestic violence laws, he claimed they couldn't charge him with domestic violence because it was a legal status that approximated marriage. And the Ohio Supreme Court said, well, no, it wasn't quite close enough to marriage to count. And so we've been able to work now with some things in the state that aren't close enough to marriage, but are very, very limited because of that constitutional amendment. So it's not just the legislature that's impacted by religious thought. Of course, it was the voters of Ohio who were also similarly impacted. So by going first, I get the opportunity, or I'm going to take the opportunity to review a little bit about how we pass laws and where all of those biases can come into play along the way. Just very, very briefly, Equality Ohio, working for our state, our home, our lives, the LGBT community. We are two organizations. We are Equality Ohio and we are Equality Ohio Education Fund. Today I'm here as the Equality Ohio Education Fund, educating you all. That at least is the hope. When we go to lobby, we go as Equality Ohio, all right? So because that's our lobbying arm. So for LGBT folks, there's kind of three different things that we might be talking about. Federal protection, state protection, local protection. Essentially, with very, very few exceptions, LGBT people in Ohio are without protections at the state or federal level at all. No non-discrimination, no relationship recognition. We have very, very limited hate crimes protection from the federal bill that passed recently, but you have to engage on federal, the crime has to occur on federal property, cross state lines, or impact your ability to do business, which most hate crimes do not rise to that level. An example of one that does, McConnellsville, back in March of 2011. A gentleman ran a horse breeding farm, Eggs are freaks, burned in hell, painted on the fencing, and then the barn was burned to the ground with all 8 horses in it, which obviously impacted his ability to do business. That rose to the level of a hate crime. Right? But most crimes against LGBT people don't, so it's assault and not a hate crime. So that's the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Act has been passed, so it offers a little bit of protection. You also know that we repealed the Don't Ask, Don't Tell. In a lot of civil rights movements, and I'm using that with a small c and a small r, the first thing that they do is desegregate the military, right? And so that was why the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell is really, really important to the movement, is to basically desegregate the military. But this is a list of kind of some of the laws that we're still trying to have passed at the federal level and that have not passed. One is for state workers to have domestic partner benefits, to early treatment for HIV, the Employment Non-Discrimination Act, adoption. A lot of states, including Ohio, don't allow same-sex couples to adopt children together. We aren't covered under family leave for our employers if something happens to one of our partners or something like that. Some of these are duplicated because of the House bill or Senate bill. It's still legal to discriminate against us in credit. That's one of the ways you keep gay people from living in your neighborhood, is you don't give them a mortgage. We have, while LGBT people make up maybe 5 to 10% of the general population, we make up 20 to 40% of the homeless youth population. And the reason we don't know the exact number is because it requires people to self-report. And since there's no census data, nothing on LGBT people, we have to go on self-reporting. That's why the numbers vary so widely. Respect for Marriage Act is what would repeal the entire Defense of Marriage Act at the federal level. If some of you are following the Supreme Court's looking at a section of that federal DOMA, which is Section 3 only. So it's in June, we expect a decision. And if they rule it unconstitutional, it's only a piece of the federal DOMA. You'd still need this Respect for Marriage Act in order to get rid of the rest of the federal DOMA. Anti-bullying laws, making it, we still have a lot of kids in school being bullied based on sexual orientation and gender identity. Incident happened down in the Union Scioto School District where a child speaking up in classroom was caught on videotape. It's partially the reason that it became the big case that it was, and the ACLU, thank you very much, was involved in that. Allegedly the adults involved said to this child, and this is a Bible-beating part of the state. You're just going to have to expect this kind of thing to happen. Right, this is 2011 in Ohio. All right, so rather than knowing that they have to protect all children from bullying, that somehow if it's religiously motivated bullying, that it's different. Right, so we're still living under that. Tax parity for health plan. I'm not sure if you're aware of it, but if LGBT people receive domestic partner benefits from an employer, while spouses receive that tax-free, the piece that's paid for by the employer is not taxed because they're spouses. Domestic partners have to pay federal income tax on that money, and often makes it too expensive because it kicks people into new tax brackets and all that kind of stuff. Fortunately, in Ohio, we did manage to get the state income tax removed. Right? So there's no state income tax on that, but there is federal income tax on that. That's what that tax parity piece would be. The Tyler Clemente, if you heard that case, this is a student in college who roommate set up a camera, taped him with the guy, and then put it out on social media, and Tyler committed suicide shortly thereafter. And so that's the same kind of thing, anti-bullying in college level. Uniting American Families Act, being able to sponsor your partner for immigration in the country. Currently we can't do that. And the newest one is the Military Spouses Equal Treatment Act. Now that we got rid of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, having spouses of our service members who happen to be LGBT at this point being treated equally with other spouses. All the places that you could get, that you could get religion to impact type of things. But when we're trying to pass state law, the easy part is finding us a sponsor. We can usually find that these are kind of our 3 top sponsors right now: Antonio, Ross McGregor, and Mike Stiziano. Ross McGregor is a Republican, we have to define the problem and the solution. We have to find sponsors willing to, in some cases, and in Ross's case, this might be true, put their next election at risk, right? Because they're being openly supportive of LGBT, even though Ross, certainly this is really important to him, but he had trouble getting elected the second time around. So this does impact their future election. Not so much the general election, but the primary challenges is what they're really worried about, getting somebody from the far right challenging them in a primary and thereby losing their seat. That's what they're quite often really concerned about. We have to write the legislation, find co-sponsors, the more co-sponsors and the more Republican bipartisan support we get, the better, and then actually introduce the legislation. We don't have any in at the moment. The one that we call the Equal Housing Employment Act, which would add sexual orientation and gender identity to the state's non-discrimination laws, will probably be dropped later in April or beginning of May, I would guess. Right now, everybody's kind of tied up in the budget, so we don't want it lost in the budget, so we can wait a little while. But it will be Nikki and Ross who drop that. All right, what's the role of party leadership? In the House, we have William Batchelder, in the Senate, we have Keith Faber. But these guys, when that bill drops, okay, fine, we got their sponsor, we go to drop the bill. These guys decide which committee those bills are going into, and they often let their own personal beliefs affect where they put this, because they don't want to necessarily, if they are against it, right, they're not going to want to put it in a committee where it's likely to get action. All right, so sometimes they hold it in rules and reference. That's when they're really worried about it. They don't want it to go anywhere. They will put it in rules and reference. Otherwise, they'll generally put it in a committee where they know it's not going to go anywhere. And so both of those, the people in those positions, these are just the people who currently hold those positions, have that kind of power based on their own personal beliefs. Will go or not. And then we have who are we, going to have talk to these legislators? Certainly, our opponents come in. They no longer necessarily come in so much and talk about their religious beliefs. They know that doesn't work that well. So they code it in otherwise, and actually at the end of this, have some nice little quotes, actually the way you'll hear them talk when they're opposed. But the opponents do come in, and the last time we had the opponents in, they actually talked about things they thought gay people did in bed, and the legislators are like, okay, no, we don't need to go there. But yeah, they get interesting. But who are they going to find credible? And so mostly what we're doing at this point is looking at religious leaders and business leaders, because business leaders are who they're really going to listen to, as well as religious leaders. Fortunately, back in 2009, which was the year we actually got this, where this picture was taken, when we actually had it pass through a committee and then pass the House, it died in the Senate. But we had the Methodist bishop from this area testify on our behalf. Unfortunately, one of the Republicans didn't happen to be Methodist, and he ended up voting yes. All right, so they do listen to their faith leaders. Right, if they can say, "Hey, look, my faith leader just said that this was okay," right? It gave him cover where he could actually vote. He was later. This wasn't Ross McGregor. It was somebody else. He was later challenged in a primary, very, very far right primary challenge. Forced him to go door to door. He'd never had to go door to door during an election before. And what he said to us after that was, he said, "Well, you know what I found out?" We're like, "Yeah, tell us, what'd you find out?" He said, "Nobody cared." It was interesting because he was always worried about what was going to happen in the end of this primary. He said not a single person asked him about it. Right? And he was kind of impressed that actually happened. But this, they really do worry about how their constituents are going to respond and what is the religious reaction. Right? And if we give them religious cover sometimes, it actually helps. Right? So we often end up trying to get these religious leaders out there. And then this gentleman was speaking on behalf of Cardinal Health as a business who wanted supporting this. But even if we get it into a committee where it's friendly, the committee chair, right, if they're opposed based on religion, they can just bury it. Right? All they have to do normally is have the sponsors come in and give testimony, and then they don't have to do anything else. Right? So if they oppose the legislation for whatever reason, they can just bury it. It dies at the end of the General Assembly. So we have Equal Housing Employment Act since 2003, I believe, and it gets buried in different places over the time and eventually dies at the end of each General Assembly, and then we have to reintroduce it about a year in hopes of moving it along. Usually it's leadership that's been in the way most of the time. Then say we got it past the committee, of course we have to get it past the leader again, who can decide what is above the black line and below the black line. If you don't, when you're looking at what's going to be listened to, what's before the floor, things that are below the black line are not going to get heard that day. Things above the black line will be heard that day, and they can just leave it below the black line for as long as they want to. And you never know. Even in these places, we could get amendments at the last minute that minimize our legislation or do something that we don't like. There's not much we can do at that point either. So, if you ever want to talk a long story about how they do that, I can tell that, but I won't do it today. And then, of course, you have to start over again in the other chamber and hope. 2009, by the way, is when the Democrats controlled the House, and we were able to get this through the House, but died in the Senate where they had Republican leadership. Now, if we had bills passed slightly, different bills both, then they have to go back to a joint committee, of course, and they have to agree on one version. We've gotten close to this on anti-bullying stuff before, but generally at this point, anything that's LGBT specific gets hauled out, so unfortunately. And then of course the governor could veto the bill, even if it, after it passes both chambers. Just because I have Governor Kasich's picture up there does not mean he would veto, however, okay? Just saying the governor passed that on. Alright. So here are some of the things that, that we don't have basically in the bottom of some things we did. So I mentioned that there's no inclusion of sexual orientation and gender identity in the state's non-discrimination laws. The anti-bullying or safe schools bills laws basically require a school to have a policy that says don't bully anyone. And that's about it. What we know from that, statistical and all kinds of studies that have been done in schools, is that if we can get an enumeration of those characteristics and traits disproportionately affected by bullying, so I'll try to do this slowly. So a bill that does something like this: don't bully anyone, including, but not limited to, the following real or perceived characteristics and traits that are disproportionately affected by bullying and harassment: race, religion, national origin, appearance, socioeconomic status, ability, disability, sexual orientation, gender identity, on and on. I don't mind if that's a page long, right? The current version is only a paragraph long, but just get those things out there so that when they're doing training and they're training about what the policy is, you don't get an administrator saying, this is a Bible beating part of the state. You just have to expect that kind of thing to happen. So it becomes part of what's going on with parents, with the administrator, the teachers are looking at, and they realize they really do have to protect all of the students. Again, we're not included in the State Hate Crimes Act. No relationship recognition that mandates anything. We have some domestic partner registries in some of the cities. Those are completely voluntary registries, meaning that nobody's compelled to do anything because you're on that registry. But your business, say they're giving domestic partner benefits and they want a way to qualify your relationship, or say that you're not trying to cheat the system, you can say, well, I'm registered with this domestic partner registry, and then they can use that to qualify the relationship, but it's purely voluntary. If we did anything that mandated, we'd run up against that constitutional amendment. Transgender people are not currently allowed to change their birth certificate gender marker, which, certainly in an age where we've got all kinds of issues with ID, that's problematic because their birth certificate may say one thing, while the driver's license, their social security card, their passport, and everything else say something else, right? And then the fact that they have documents that don't match send up red flags all over the place. And a lot of people lose their job at this point. All kinds of things are impacted by that. No option for second parent adoption. So one parent is the legal parent, the other parent is very much at legal risk in their relationship with the child because they can't co-adopt the child. There are some legal papers, co-custody agreement type things that are being used in the state. Marissa back there actually knows a lot more about this than I do, that are being used in the state. The Supreme Court, Ohio Supreme Court, seems to be hinting that they would uphold them, but we actually haven't tested that yet. Okay, then we have three things, because marriage is such a scary thing, or same-sex marriage is such a scary thing for people in Ohio. Not only do we have a law that defines marriage between a man and woman, we have a statewide Defense of Marriage Act which says we won't recognize marriages from other states. And we have that very restrictive constitutional amendment. It's one of the most restrictive. The only thing that really kind of saves us a little bit here in Ohio is that Supreme Court decision, because in Michigan it went the other way. Their Supreme Court ruled very, very harshly. Even more problems. So, of course, those are the way things we'd like to correct with. If you're out there talking to legislators, and this is something that's important to you, the Equal Housing and Employment Act, they're likely to kind of recognize what that is, since it's been before them so many times. We don't have a bill number right now. That would be great if we did, but we don't. Comprehensive Safe Schools Act probably wouldn't mean a whole lot to them, but talking about improving the safe schools legislation or policies to better cover LGBT kids, or any child in particular. These others haven't really been before them in any way that they're likely to remember, unless you run into Antonio, McGregor, or Stiziano. Stiziano is one of the people, some of the hate crime piece in the safe school piece. So they would know more. We actually now have 2 openly gay state house representatives. Nikki Antonio out of Lakewood, Ohio, and Tim Brown out of Bowling Green, Ohio. Tim Brown's brand new this year. So hopefully, and Tim Brown actually is a Republican, so we're hoping that his conversation within the caucus can help sway some of the folks in the Republican Party. All right, so those are some other things that we'd like to see. These are policies. Currently, the state of Ohio doesn't protect people based on gender identity. They do under sexual orientation. There's no domestic partner benefits for state employees. We still have issues of mostly some degree of hospital visitation. But there's an Obama policy that basically says if hospitals don't honor your wishes of who you want in your room with you, etc., that they could lose their federal funding, Medicare, Medicaid. But again, it's a policy. The next executive could undo it. So I continue to put this up here because there's no law yet. Inheritance taxes, we're legal strangers to each other, so even, maybe leave stuff to your partner in your will. Yep, except for the pay inheritance taxes. Okay, your spouses don't. The whole co-custody thing, the family status for public facilities, if we're not, quite qualify as family, right, by definitions often. Inclusion in surveys, right, census, etc. Not that we aren't part of those census, but, actually identifying LGBT people on it so that we can say how many people are in a certain district. And including the family health survey, because there's a lot of issues of access to healthcare or healthcare that is accepting. Often we have issues with doctors and other people not being very accepting, especially if we're gender non-conforming. So these are some good things that have happened. I mentioned hospital visitation. And they're starting to study barriers to healthcare. That's a good thing. They're starting to study LGBT aging issues. My partner and I, I'm not quite there, but my partner and I, when we decide to retire, when we decide to retire, if we go into a retirement center, most of them are not going to let us be in the same space together. We'd have to rent 2 places. So that's problematic, as well as we don't have, a lot of the people my age older don't have children. Their families may have disowned them years ago. And so just the whole issue of who's caring for LGBT aging folks is really becoming an issue today. So they're at least beginning to study those things. And then HUD added sexual orientation and gender identity to HUD housing non-discrimination just recently, in 2010. So something's beginning to move. At the state level, a couple of good things we've done. Transgender people can change their driver's license gender marker. Can't do the birth certificate yet, but they are able to change their driver's license. We do have a next of kin registry for first responders. Unfortunately, most people don't know it's out there. And also, I discovered the governor's office thinks this is a domestic partner registry. To correct them on that. It's actually all it is if you're in an accident and the first responders take your ID and they look you up in the system, right, to find out what's in there about you. One of the things that comes up is this next of kin registry, and it could say that so-and-so holds the durable health care power of attorney for this person, and they can voluntarily do something about it. It does not mandate they do anything. So we've had stories of couples, one's in a car accident, is unconscious, flown to a hospital, and they leave the partner on the side of the road, essentially the car is towed, and just aren't willing to transport them with the partner because they don't recognize the relationship. In this case, Kimberly had to have somebody come from Fort Clinton and drive her to Toledo in order for her to get to the hospital, and she held durable health care power of attorney, and they wouldn't take it. So we have those kinds of issues. And then I mentioned the no state tax on domestic partner benefits. That's because we had a lesbian in charge of the Department of Insurance a couple years ago. It makes a difference. So that Ohio ranks other states. We tied for second to last in the nation with Georgia, Kentucky, Idaho, and Tennessee. We do rank higher then Arkansas, Mississippi, Nebraska, North and South Dakota, and South Carolina. Mostly it's because those states don't have any openly gay people in their legislature. That's the one thing that kind of bumps us up, is because of Nick and Brown. Okay. So if you're out there talking to a legislator and this is an important issue to you, you know, enumerating those safe schools laws, the Equal Housing and Employment Act, and probably the next thing we would be concentrating on is that hate crimes thing. People have issues with hate crimes legislation just in general, let alone adding sexual orientation and gender identity to it. So it's a weird place and probably a very difficult pull through this current legislature, but it's there. We thought we could do the gender marker through policy, but that's pretty much been shot down. It's going to have to probably be legislation. That hospital visitation, we'd really like to see some law, because that the federal policy may or may not stand up against the next president. Right? And the domestic partner benefits for state workers is certainly something that would have to work with unions to do, but could be done. But not until 2015, which is the next time the union contracts are up. Just kind of locally, I told you how bad Ohio ranks with the, against other states, but we're in the top 10 nationally for local law. Okay? So we've got all kinds of cities that have passed local protections, including Columbus, Cleveland, Cincinnati, Dayton, Yellow Springs, Athens, Bowling Green. I mean, there's a whole Newark and Coshocton. I was like, what? Newark and Coshocton. Somebody pointed out to me that there are a lot of ancient hippies in Newark and Coshocton. I didn't know that, right? But it might explain how. And both of them have identical kind of bad language. It's not horrible language. It's old, dated language. And so it makes sense that they were done by the same group of people. So anyway, but yeah, we do have a lot of local protections, particularly around non-discrimination. And also, just I like to put this. I often use LGBT, but I don't discredit anybody who is same-gender loving or queer or uses some other language. It's just if I use all of the words, I would spend my entire hour just listing them out. Okay, so these are a lot of those cities. If you don't see your city up there and you'd like to have them up there, please contact me and we can make that work to make that happen. Actually, the gay games are coming to Cleveland in 2014, Cleveland and Akron. And one of the things that my organization, it's not the gay games, so I want their support on this, is trying to do is to see if all of the locations for the events, if we can get these kinds of local protections for them. It's interesting to call a Wycliffe, Ohio, or Willoughby, Ohio, and actually have all these people, and had a conversation with them. They're like, oh yeah, well, we wouldn't do that. I said, you know what I'm worried about is your hotels. Because we really have a lot of problems with hotels. Not renting a single bedroom room to two people of the same sex. They frequently say you don't do that. And they're like, oh, well, we need to fix this. I'm like, yes, here's how we can do this. Most people, I find surprising that a lot of people out there already presume all of these kinds of protections exist. You know, I've looked at textbooks that are being used in colleges. You know, on the section on homosexuality, I always like how it's labeled that way. On the section on homosexuality, it says, laws have been passed to prevent this kind of discrimination. I'm like, yeah, the state where the book was written, right? But not in Ohio. So, yeah, a lot of people already think these things exist. Then some of the counties, keep in mind that most counties don't have home rule, right? So there's very little they can do, with the exception of Cuyahoga and Summit. You guys are all Northeast Ohio, right? Okay, we need to work with Cuyahoga and Summit because they can do everything a city can do. They have home rule. So neither one of them has yet passed a county-wide non-discrimination. I want Summit to do that. Everybody here will talk to Sandra Kirk, okay? Tell her you want this stuff. Okay. Just some of our most recent polling. Some of this is old. Only the bottom number there. Is that another one? Yes. Okay. The bottom two numbers are 2012. The others are 2009. It costs a lot of money to do a statewide poll. 2009 was the last time we were able to report it. But you know, this is kind of some of the support in Ohio for some of these different issues. But 2012, civil unions was at 64%, marriage was at 45%. There was one poll that had marriage at 52%, but it's all the other polls that we've done in the last year or so are back, and they're more in the 40s, high 40s. So it's coming up. Just hasn't gotten high enough yet. All right. I've got history here, but that's kind of, I stole another presentation and then modified it because I'm going to skip through that a little bit. I kind of mentioned that we've been doing this for a while. We've got, bipartisan support. When we passed it to the House in 2009, we had 5 Republicans vote yes for it. All of those Republicans who ran again were reelected, so they didn't lose their jobs. One just, he retired, he wants to come back. But 2 of them have been promoted to the Senate to fill empty seats. So their party hasn't penalized them for it. Last year it was House Bill 335 and Senate Bill 231. It pretty much died without getting any attention last year. We're hoping a little bit more attention this year based on what happened in November of last year, right, with the Republican Party trying to rebrand themselves a little bit, that maybe we can push them along. Ross McGregor seems to be pretty hopeful that that's maybe true, that we can get a little bit more action now. Safe schools thing last year, working with Marissa and some other folks in the ACLU, we did get the safe school stuff improved to include cyberbullying mandatory training, but not enumeration. And like I said, when they get down to the nitty gritty, they always throw that one out in order to get the bill passed. I guess that was the enumeration bill last year. Some of you had contact with the DOE or the School Board Association or any local school board. They can enumerate the policies. They haven't. A lot of them haven't done so. Yeah, there are a few that have some surprising ones. Columbus has, Dayton has. Okay. Now more specifically to your piece. Talking about what role does religion play in this? That's kind of an interesting that we're even having to say that because we all know it. All right. Mostly it's Judeo-Christian values that we're working with here. In Judaism, we only really have the Old Testament only. So a lot of folks from Jewish traditions don't have as much issue with LGBT stuff, especially when it comes to women, because the Old Testament doesn't refer to women at all. But they're, unless it's Orthodox, they're really not opposed at this point. We all know Christian, we have the Old and New Testament being a place where we do have women mentioned. Thank you, Paul. And then, of course, the Muslim tradition. So, now what are the root issues that we pretty much have in there? One is the issue around homosexuality. Be clear, the Bible doesn't say homosexuality. That word didn't exist until the 1840s. Right? It's simply been translated in that way. So we've got that issue. There are references to cross-dressing, specifically to men wearing women's clothes and women wearing men's clothes, and that then often gets extended to people who are transgender. And then what I think, and a lot of people think, is really the root cause is misogyny. You have, if you notice, there isn't so much an issue out there with women. It really isn't, having to do with the Old Testament, not saying anything about it, right? But it's not as big of an issue for a lot of men as another man wanting to be in a relationship with another man. One of them has to, and I don't mean to say this quite so bluntly, but it has to be in woman's role, right, by definition, right? And that any man wanting to be in a woman's role is somehow horrible, right? Because the woman is bad. And all that kind of stuff. It's not necessarily being played out consciously, right? But is really one of the main things that's going on out there when you hear women talking. It also explains why there's not as much of an issue with women, right? As well as most transgender people, it's not the women, the trans men that are quite so much of an issue out there when you're looking stuff, but the trans women. A man wanting to become a woman, how could they possibly want to become a woman, right? And that's all plays out in that whole misogyny piece. And then, of course, there's the ick factor. I keep telling people, I said, I have the same response to you folks. But I'm not going to stand in the way of your being able to marry each other, okay? So, but it is a major factor, right? Is what they call the ick factor. So how do we hear this expressed? At least it's kind of like Ohio lawmakers. Often you'll hear them say, well, gay people are not politically powerless or historically marginalized. And we say, where have you been? Right? But this is an argument you will hear in a lot from the religious organizations, particularly Citizens for Community Values out of Sharon, Bill. I used to say Cincinnati, my Cincinnati friends got really mad. This is kind of the argument there that we don't need to be protected, right, because we have political power, etc. Haven't been historically marginalized. That's the one I just don't get. But, you will hear it listed as well. We need business owners to have religious freedom. Right? We don't want them to be forced to make rainbow cupcakes for the local GSA if they don't believe in it. So you'll often hear that as an argument. Don't want to infringe on business owners' religious freedom. I was in Bowling Green for several months defending a non-discrimination ordinance there. And I was in talking to the mayor, and there was a business in town, I won't name it, it was a plumbing business. But they were very, very concerned about this plumbing business because the owner only hired people from his own church. And they're like, well, how is this going to affect him? He only hires people from his own church. I said, I don't know, he's already in violation of state and federal discrimination laws based on religion. Apparently he's getting away with it. And the mayor's like, oh, and I never heard about it again. You'll hear it that way. You may hear it as well, if we condone this behavior, we are not serving the gay person, and this comes from love. Right? That we need to make being gay as hard as possible so that they will try as hard as they can to be sure. It's kind of that message that comes in there. And if these laws pass, we will be harming children or potentially harming children. If we end up bringing the marriage thing back to the ballot, I'm going to bet more than I'm worth, right, on the kinds of ads you're going to see. And they're going to be things like, that schools are going to have to teach about gay sex, and they're going to have to teach about it, and this is going to harm my kindergartner. And we're all like, who teaches that in kindergarten anyway? Right? But also around non-discrimination, you will see ads out there. We did in Bowling Green, where you see ads where it's somehow, actually Anchorage was the most recent place. They have a cartoon of a 6 foot, very much taller man and a woman standing next to him in a dress, hairy legs, applying for a job at a child care facility. Right? And the ad goes, if you pass this law, this person is going to be, this woman has to hire this guy, right, to take care of your children. Right? And so that's a really big one that gets used over in some, in several variations that it comes out. But that's actually extremely effective, unfortunately. And as a community, we haven't quite figured out how to deal with that very well. But just for your own edification, there is no law in Ohio that says a man has to use a men's room and a woman has to use a woman's room. Try going to a large event and watching what happens when there's a line a mile long from the women's room and the men's room is empty. The women start using the men's room. Okay? We all know this happens. Right? And that's perfectly legal, right? And so, I was talking to the prosecutor of Bowling Green about this issue, and I pointed out that he goes, oh, yeah, you're right. Then they tried to pass a law. It didn't work. I said, wait, the very first thing that's going to happen is you're going to have alumni come to a Bowling Green State University football game. And their lines are going to be long, the women are going to use the men's room, you're going to have to arrest your alumni, all right, for using the wrong bathroom. And then they went, okay, maybe that isn't such a good idea. But this kind of stuff comes up all the time, and that prosecutor, has anybody actually been out in a public place with somebody who's cross-dressing? All right. Okay, and so have I. Especially if they're just cross-dressing as opposed to being transgender, they're actually just cross-dressing. Everybody knows it. Okay? If they want to go and molest your wife and children in the bathroom, they're better off just staying in their own gender clothes and sneaking in the bathroom because they're less likely to be noticed. But of course, that kind of argument doesn't work. All right? But that last message there is very, very highly effective. It's one of the reasons that when they run marriage campaigns, in states, that whatever percentage you go into the campaign with is what you, if you're going to win or you lose, is what you win or lose by. They don't gain anything through a campaign like that, is what they've learned. So if they go into a marriage campaign, Maine, Maryland, and Washington all had this happen. They went into it with low 50s approval rate, and that's what they came out of it with. Because they're dealing with millions and millions of dollars in messaging, usually about how this is going to harm children. Actually, the opponents didn't use that in Maine, Maryland, and Washington this time around. They used it in California very, very effectively. They didn't use it in that, and they lost. So the next place that they have one, I think they're going to bring it back. And if that were to end up to be Ohio, you'd be seeing it here. Yeah, we talked about teaching same-sex marriage, cross-dressing, the right of the child. My life, and yeah, if the children know that people are okay, with same-sex relationships, somehow they'll choose homosexuality. Anyway, love to have questions. Yeah.
I'm just curious, do you think that if we finally get legislation to pass on a federal level for marriage, that a lot of the issues that you're facing, you wouldn't need as many laws passed for other things, like, when you come to adoption, housing, and tax laws, as far as inheritance and things like that. I mean, do you think that by passing that,
The problem is that the U.S. Constitution leaves the issue of marriage to the states. So there really is no such thing as federal marriage. They'd have to create it somehow, right? They don't, and so it really is a state issue. That DOMA that we were talking about, it just says that the federal government won't recognize same-sex marriages that are legal in the states. So that's the problem with that. So we're likely to have to battle this out state by state. It's possible that the U.S. Supreme Court, they've taken 2 cases that they're hearing at the end of March, and then they'll decide to do. Unlikely are they to make a ruling at this point that actually affects states like Ohio. And even if they strike down that Section 3 of DOMA, which is the piece that keeps the federal government from recognizing legal marriages, say out of Massachusetts or one of the other states, unlikely to help any couples in Ohio, even if they were married in Massachusetts or anywhere else, Canada, wherever they may have been married, it's unlikely to help them if they're living in a state where it's not legally recognized. So, it's probably going to take more than that. It is part of the reason why you see like Rhode Island and Illinois and some of these other states pushing really hard to pass marriage before the Supreme Court hears it, because of course what we know is that the more states that have marriage, or more, if you look at decriminalization of sodomy, it took until they had only 13 states left where it was illegal before they rule in Lawrence v. Texas. So they're trying to get as many states right now to pass it as they can, so that they go into that more. But most people don't think there's going to be any widespread decision out of the Supreme Court. And even the Supreme Court could simply say, we aren't going to listen to them. Now, I see your hand. The other concern we have is that with non-discrimination non-existent in the state of Ohio for LGBT people, if we pass same-sex marriage in Ohio, the legislators could turn around and start defining the benefits that go along with being a spouse as being for opposite-sex spouses. All right, so that non-discrimination piece is really, really important. And that's only a possibility. Maybe it wouldn't happen, but I would be very concerned with some of our legislators and that actually happens. Just sorry.
Can you explain why if the Supreme Court strikes down the California law, why that doesn't affect Ohio? Aren't they similar?
Well, the way that the appeals court had heard that case roll is they said that it's unconstitutional to take away a right you granted somebody. And the only state that granted marriage and then took it away is California.
Oh, I see.
Right? So if they uphold the appeals court decision, then that's all they've upheld. It only affects California. Yeah. And most people out there having these kinds of discussions don't realize how limited these things are. And like I said, both of those cases, the court, the ACLU should cut in here if I say something wrong because I'm not an attorney. That both of those cases, there's an out that the court could take in saying that the people who are opposing LGBT people in those cases don't have standing. Both of those cases are open for that, in which case they don't have standing, and then just then marriage in California would be legal, and they would strike down that section 3, but the court would never actually rule on it in those two. There are other cases behind it, but those would be another year down the line, probably.
Yeah, I heard you mention don't ask, don't tell briefly, and you were saying something about LGBT, but you didn't really mention T in the military.
Yeah, we have not gotten to that point yet. There still is a don't ask, don't tell around transgender individuals in the military.
Oh, really?
Yeah. You can't be openly transgender in the military right now.
I guess, all right.
Most people do their military stint and then transition, but a lot of, I know, service members would like to be able to transition earlier rather than wait till they're
Those of us that are meeting with legislators tomorrow, I don't know how much time we're actually going to have with them, and obviously this issue is very important. Several other we're going to want to touch on. We want to cut right to the chase in so many words. Like how would we, what would be the best single thing to bring up?
just say that, you know, you support lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people having full rights, fairness, use fairness if you're talking about Republican, not equality. It's the word in there, a lot of Republicans have equality means, you know, equality of outcome rather than opportunity. And so we try to use fairness when we're talking about the Republican. We want LGBT people to have the same ability to get a job, live where they want, live, work, play where they want, and we need to pass non-discrimination laws in order to make that possible. And that kids need to be better protected from bullying in school.
So to bring up the three you listed was the Equal Housing, Equal Employment, the Safe Schools Act, and right now.
Yeah, a lot. Yeah, like I said, without a bill number right now, some would recognize Equal Housing and Employment Act because it's been there. But I mean, there's a lot of folks, you know, great. When you're a bunch of gay people going to the State House, there's some legislators who run as fast as they can to the bathroom, all right, and stay there until you're out, all right. And so we often are just talking to their aides. So a lot of the legislators haven't heard the words or haven't had this conversation necessarily, so they may not recognize it. So, you know, if I had a bill number, I'd say yes, reference the bill number, but I don't. Maybe just talk about it in general, that this is something you support, you know, this is full. Talking to our legislators about same-sex marriage is kind of a wasted effort because that's a voter issue in Ohio, not a legislative issue.
You were talking about like the state constitution, but then you're saying you've had success with Cleveland and Cincinnati. How far, like did the mayor of Columbus or the city government defy the state as far as if the state has a regulation and the city says, you know, no, we're not, we think that's crap.
Well, the state doesn't have, they really don't have any, besides that constitutional amendment, which was a voter thing, the voters did that. You know, besides that, there aren't a whole lot of outwardly, you know, anti. Right? There's a lot of stuff that just affects us by lack of being included as opposed to outright being against us. So there's a lot that the cities can do up until the point of, you know, they can pass local hate crimes, they can pass, the school boards can do, I know I'm running out of time, the anti-bullying enumeration, you know, they can do non-discrimination, they can create these domestic partner registries, they can offer benefits to their employees, all of those things, and a lot of them do. I mean, Lucas County, Toledo, Columbus, Lucas County, Franklin County, I mean, there's really not much more than to do. They've tried everything. Cleveland's got a little wiggle room around transgender issues that they can, you know, improve and that kind of thing. But so there's not, you know, there's, beyond that, there's not much they can do. Now, we do know that there are judges, a lot of this is court case precedent, particularly the adoption issue and the birth certificate. Ohio, apparently, according to this court case, has a vested interest in making sure that only chromosomally female and chromosomally male people marry each other, and that's why they don't want the birth certificate to be changed. So, you know, we have a lot of what would appear to be same-sex couples out there that are married in Ohio, because one's a trans woman. Birth certificate says male, right? And it's legal for them to get married. So, but that's a court case, and so, you know, we have to get them to pass a law overriding those court precedents.
But the city can't defy the state as far as marriage.
No, they can't.
Or the county.
We heard that that's what happened in San Francisco. Is San Francisco decided to, they got shut down pretty quickly. They could, but they're unlikely to remain in office a whole lot longer.
Right.
Although it has worked for us. I don't know if you heard recently in Pomeroy, Ohio, this very small town, southern Ohio. The police chief there had a part-time gay police officer who was being harassed by the mayor. Now, the police chief said in his complaint that that was illegal. It wasn't. That it was illegal to try to force this guy out of his job, and they were opening themselves up for a lawsuit. Bless his heart that he thought that to be true, because he ended up getting the mayor to resign within days. So sometimes it works in our favor. But so no, we
Church closed, I want to hear working.
Right, yeah. And his partner would come visit him, and she was really opposed to that. Yes.
I suspect the legislators run when they see the cases coming to. Is there any way to talk to people that don't want to be talked to?
Do it in district.
Okay.
Call it from home, saying, okay, legislator, when you're back here in your district, back here at home, let's sit down for coffee sometime and talk. And I find,
State legislators.
your state legislators, they go home, they're home usually Friday through Monday.
What, they're at physical home where they live?
Yeah, physical home where they live.
Oh, okay.
It usually Friday through Monday, over the weekends, they're usually home. And just or during the summer when the session's out, right? And sitting down with them over coffee. We find it far more likely that if we have, I know this sounds weird for you guys, but there's probably faith leaders out there who believe that our government should be run under secular principles. That having a faith leader call them, you can get that appointment a lot easier. So that's usually how we do it. But that works pretty well for us.
It said that the Ohio ban on gay marriage and gay unions is a voter issue. I suppose I'm idealistic, but how does that stand? How did the citizenry, so to speak, get to vote on the basic civil rights of a certain group of people when this ban itself seems to be like a violation of the 14th Amendment? How does it stand?
Because LGBT people have not been ruled to be covered by strict scrutiny.
We're not a suspect class yet.
Yeah, we're not a suspect class, right? So it wouldn't be the same as turning around and saying interracial marriages are illegal. Because there you have people who are determined to be a suspect class. We have not. That is one of the questions that's before the Supreme Court with these cases, is whether we are a suspect class or not. And so that may get determined, but that would be something that happens this year. It certainly doesn't cover 2004.
Do they still use the argument because it's a choice?
Yes, and of course, sexual behavior is a choice for all of us, right? Often we're not having the same conversations, about attraction and all that kind of stuff. They can't get there. It's an ick that gets it right. I'm taking way more of my time. I need to let these guys move on.
They're still trying to get the same-sex marriage repealed in 2014 is not valid.
There are some people who are trying to do that. I'm not behind that because if they lose, they could put Ohio and every other state with the constitutional amendment back about 10 years. Until remember I said that Maine, Maryland, and Washington, what they went into it with in terms of support is what they won or lost by. If you don't gain support. So one poll at 52% for marriage equality in Ohio, and the other polls are still in the 40s, is not enough in my mind to guarantee that. So for me, 2014 is a little too early. Besides that, I have issues with the language. Speaking of religious issues, really quickly, the language on that petition would not only allow, it talks about religious freedom, it allows religious institutions not only not to conduct marriages, but not to recognize them, which is a problem because a lot of our hospitals are religious institutions. Ohio Health is a Methodist institution. But they're still religious organizations, and if they wanted to, based on that amendment, they could not recognize somebody's relationship. I have issues with that. And right now, no pastor, no faith leader has to marry anybody they don't want to, and that would not change. Yeah, that's the way it is now, that's the way it would be. nothing about gay marriage would make anybody marry anybody. But right now they don't have to marry anybody they don't want to. I don't have problems with saying that they, reiterating it. It's just a backup. But the part that involves the hospitals is, for me, is problematic.